Okay, let's dive right into this. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating web of ancient texts, esoteric lore, and alternative historical paradigms. In this explainer, we're looking at sources that propose a profound and honestly deeply hidden connection between the world's oldest mythologies.
I mean, it sounds exactly like the setup for a high fantasy novel, doesn't it? But what if dragons, vampires, and ancient gods actually shared the exact same bloodline? Well, according to the curated texts and ancient records we're examining today, these concepts aren't just loosely related, they are completely intertwined. These historical accounts suggest that our absolute most foundational stories of kingship and human civilization all trace back to one single, highly advanced lineage.
So, here's our roadmap for peeling back the layers of this explainer. We'll start with the Anunnaki dragon gods, then trace their rather surprising Transylvanian and Ubaid origins. After that, we'll look at the hierarchy of the Shining Ones, break down the actual biology of dragonhood, and finally, wrap up with the legacy of kingship.
All right, Section 1, the Anunnaki dragon gods. We're going to look in partially at what these Sumerian texts actually describe.
According to the sources, the original dragon gods are identified as the Anunnaki, or Anunnaki. In ancient Sumerian, that translates directly to those who from heaven to earth came. But here is the crucial distinction the texts make. They weren't talking about mere figures of fable or, floating ethereal spirits. These records describe them as flesh and blood beings, specifically a highly advanced, interdimensional reptilian race that essentially laid the bedrock for all of human civilization. They were known as the Shining Ones.
Moving right along to Section 2, Transylvanian and Ubaid origins. Because while we usually associate the Anunnaki with ancient Mesopotamia, the literature claims their origins are located somewhere else entirely.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the physical evidence. This isn't just a myth. This is an actual ancient artifact. It's a reptilian mother and child figurine found in the graves of the Ubaid people, a culture that actually predated the Sumerians. This really anchors those wilder claims of reptilian overlords into tangible archaeological history, showing us that the people of this era literally worshipped beings with distinctly non-human serpent-like features. The ancient records reveal something fascinating. These gods were actually imported to Mesopotamia by the Ubaid, who are described as a proto-Aryan Pictish culture. Get this! The earliest evidence of these original vampiric dragon gods actually stems from Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains around 5000 BC. Yes, literally Transylvania. The Ubaid migrants fled a flood in the Black Sea region and brought this highly sophisticated dragon culture with them down into the Mesopotamian valley, where they eventually founded the first great human cities, like Eridu. Okay, on to Section 3, Hierarchy of the Shining Ones. These imported gods had a very strict and honestly pretty dramatic family structure. At the very top of this hierarchy sits Anu, the king and father of the gods. The plural of his followers, the Anunnaki, means Shining Ones, which these esoteric texts directly link to the Vedic Nagas, the ancient serpent deities of India. And alongside the patriarchal Anu is Tiamat. Described as the maiden of the waters of life, the sources recognize her as the very first great matriarch and priestess of the vampire dragon queens and kings.
But the real core of this ancient narrative revolves around a massive earth-shaking conflict between Anu's two sons, Enki and Enlil. Now this is where the alternative history really flips the script on traditional biblical narratives. Enlil is described as a storm god, or god of the mountain, who actively opposed human enlightenment. The sources actually identify him as the Jehovah of the Old Testament. Then you have his brother Enki, also known as Samael. He was the lord of the earth and the chief scientist. The texts frame Enki as the hero of human wisdom, the literal serpent in Eden who intervened to encode advanced knowledge into human genetics. Which makes perfect sense when you realize his personal emblem was a serpent coiled around the tree of life.
This brings us to Section 4, the biology of dragonhood. I want you to keep a totally open mind here because the sources define these supernatural concepts as advanced biology, not magic.
So we really have to ask, what does the word dragon actually mean in this ancient context? If we strip away all the medieval fairy tales of giant fire-breathing lizards hoarding piles of gold, what were the ancients actually describing when they used this title for their overlords? So the crucial point is the etymology. The word dragon comes from the Greek word durkastai, which simply means to see clearly. In this ancient context, a dragon wasn't a scaly monster, it was a status. It described an overlord or a seer, According to the records, these beings had unique brain chemistry and a vastly enlarged pineal gland that literally allow them to perceive higher dimensions and subtler frequencies than ordinary humans could ever pick up on.
And how exactly did they maintain this superhuman brain chemistry? Well, through what the ancient texts call ritual vampirism, but not the spooky movie kind. It was an alchemical process symbolized by the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. It involved the ingestion of something called starfire. The sources describe this as melatonin and serotonin-rich secretions from royal Grail maidens. Again, they didn't view this as a horror story. It was a rigorous biological science used to alter their brain chemistry, achieve a state of superconsciousness, and maintain their transcendent vision and extreme longevity.
Which perfectly sets up our final section, the legacy of kingship. Let's look at how this esoteric biology connects to the human history that we actually recognize today. The texts state that the Anunnaki essentially established kingship as a gift and, quite frankly, a mechanism to control humanity. They interbred with human women to create a hybrid race of overlords known as the Nephilim, or the dragon bloodline. In a really fascinating twist, the biblical Cain is cited in these esoteric sources not as a murderer, but as the very first king of this messianic succession. He possessed the high concentrations of Anunnaki blood necessary to act as the ultimate middleman between the gods and mankind.
Let's trace how this bloodline expanded across the map. You can see the movement of this dragon-linked royalty right here. It starts in Transylvania and Carpathia around 5000 BC, then moves down into Sumeria by 3500 BC. By 2170 BC, we see the formal establishment of the royal court of the dragon in Egypt, and from there, the bloodline pushes out into the Indus Valley and eventually makes up the great royal houses of Europe, like the Merovingians and Plantagenets. Their entire absolute right to rule was based entirely on this specific genetic descent from those original serpent gods.
And get a load of this linguistic connection from the ancient accounts. In Egypt, the ceremonial title for the newly crowned pharaoh was Mosh, which literally meant being anointed with the fat of the Nile crocodile, a huge reptilian symbol of kingship. This word, Moshesh, is the direct etymological root of the word Messiah. So the anointed one was, quite literally, anointed by the dragon.
And this brilliantly illustrates the lasting power of this imagery. Notice the ancient caduceus, that double snake emblem. That was originally the personal symbol of Enki, the Anunnaki scientist who encoded wisdom into humanity. Now look at how perfectly it mirrors the double helix structure of human DNA. The sources suggest this absolutely isn't a coincidence. It's a deeply embedded symbol of our hybrid genetic origins, staring us right in the face all along.
So, I want to leave you with this to chew on. If the very foundations of kingship, civilization, and even our most sacred spiritual mythologies were seeded by this ancient advanced bloodline, how much of our modern world is still operating on the blueprint of the dragon? It completely shifts how you view history, authority, and even human potential, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me to explore these incredible sources today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.